FBI yesterday, the special agent in charge of the Tampa office, gave that briefing in which he said, this is still an ongoing investigation. He called for the first time. They've always referred to Brian Laundrie as a person of interest in Gabby Petito's death and disappearance, but he used the specific term murder, which we knew they had classified this as a homicide. So what is still ongoing about this investigation? Are they still trying to nail down exactly, so they can say without a doubt that Brian Laundrie was the person who took Gabby Petito's life?
I mean, that's really it. Was it just Brian Laundrie? Was there anyone else involved? And if we determine, or law enforcement, federal agents determine that it was indeed Brian Laundrie who killed Gabby and those remains are Brian's, and that's really the end of it, Anjanette. I mean, the case is over. Can't prosecute a dead person. That goes back to, our founding fathers and even going back to England. So the criminal case will close. There will be no prosecution. Law enforcement will move on to other missing persons and other cases and investigations, open files. But we're really nearing the end of all this. Again, assuming that those remains are Laundrie's and assuming that no one else was involved in Gabby's murder.
Sure. And those remains have not been positively identified. As I mentioned, the medical examiner in Sarasota County said they are working on the remains. So they'll probably be using DNA and possibly even dental records to look at those remains and try to identify them. One of the things that I found, everybody thinks it's interesting and it is confounded by it. The feds were out there, the FBI. They had volunteer searchers. They had cadaver dogs. This was a 24,000 acre park that a lot of it was underwater. And that's what the special agent in charge of the Tampa office said yesterday. And I think we can all understand that. But, the parents call law enforcement or call their lawyer apparently Tuesday night. This is what the lawyer says, and tells the lawyer, we want to go out there. He gives the cops a heads up. They meet the family out there, the parents out there yesterday morning. And within a half hour or so, they find, the dry bag, and then the cops find the remains in the backpack. Is that shocking to you? I understand this was a big area, but it was like they went right to it. And I'm not trying to be conspiratorial here, but it just seems odd to me when they had indicated, according to the lawyer, that he might be in that specific area, that they didn't find anything.
Yeah, certainly not the best look for federal law enforcement that they were unable to find Brian after searching for weeks. And I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there on the internet and social media. And look, if those aren't Brian's remains or if evidence was planted, the notebook, the backpack, then we're going to be going in a very different direction. We're talking about obstruction of justice, charges for Laundrie's parents. False statements. There's a whole wide range of possibilities. And we can certainly go down that path if, again, it's determined that it was not Brian there or that evidence was planted. But yeah, I find it shocking. And really, this reserve was actually open the day before to the public as well. So law enforcement, at least federal agents, had really concluded their investigation before Laundrie's parents got involved.
Any parent, if they, if remains are found near your child's backpack, you're going to draw some conclusions from that, although they are waiting for the identification.
Of course, the most reasonable assumption, again, we're making assumptions here, is that those were Brian's remains. They were found next to his notebook, his backpack. Otherwise, we're talking about planting of evidence or planting of a body or remains. So, I know there's a lot of speculation out there on social media, on the internet, on message boards that, again, this is something that the Laundrie parents were up to. But until we sort of see some evidence of that, I would really, I think everyone's sort of best off waiting for those, waiting for the scientists to do their DNA, dental records, autopsy, whatever the case may be, to confirm that those are indeed Laundrie's remains.
That rambling statement he kind of gave, he said he wanted to address the victims. Does that help him at all in this? This is going straight to the penalty phase now. So on January 4th, that will begin. And the jury's going to decide whether he gets the death penalty or life in prison. So what did you think of that statement that he made?
Yeah, that rambling stream of consciousness statement, certainly not something that his attorneys agreed to or sign off on, because I don't think anyone would. I didn't think it was particularly persuasive, to be honest. I mean, he was talking about himself and how he can't watch TV. He suffers nightmares when he's responsible for the deadliest school shooting in American history. So I wasn't particularly moved. But ultimately, it's going to be up to 12 jurors to decide whether he gets the death penalty or not. I do give him credit for not unnecessarily putting the families through the liability phase, the guilt phase, unnecessarily, when it's clear, obviously, that he's guilty of these murders. And let's just move straight to the penalty phase. It's going to be life or the death penalty for Nikolas Cruz. I mean, no question, his attorneys are going to try to get the death penalty off the table. That's actually was the whole basis of the plea negotiations and why this case was going to trial. They were willing to plead the entire time. They asked the prosecution there to take the capital offense death penalty off the table. The prosecutors refused to do so out there in Broward County. So that's why we were going to trial. That's why we're actually going to trial on that assault case, which she ultimately pled to as well and is getting 25 years. So, I mean, clearly this is someone with mental health issues, does not excuse his conduct at all. He's competent to stand trial. But let's not forget, I mean, this is a man, a young man, but a man who was coloring with either crayons or colored pencils, depending on who you believe, during his assault trial. So it's clearly not all there based on that conduct. Obviously, the Parkland shooting and his statements in court yesterday.
Erase his identity in a respect, and so that the focus is truly on those victims, even though he stood up in court and spoke.
Yeah, I mean, there's two reasons. There's a general reason. You never want to humanize the defendant if you're a prosecutor. That's what you always refer to him or her as the defendant. Defense attorneys, of course, on the other hand, will refer to them by their name. They'll even sometimes try to refer to them by their first name. That's the whole psychology of prosecution versus defense. And obviously, when you're dealing with a mass shooter, the last thing you want to do is give more attention to an individual like this. Obviously is always the risk of, additional shootings, copycats, all that type of thing. And, I'm sure as a parent myself, there was an incident near my kid's school today and it was locked down. So it's every parent's worst nightmare to have someone like Nikolas Cruz come to your child's school. So you don't want to give him any more attention than he deserves.
I mean, they've stayed within the parameters so far, and I'm sure nobody wants to cause a mistrial by saying something they shouldn't be saying right as jury selection is starting. So was the judge right to not rule on this, or should he lift the order?
And Jeanette, I'm generally not a fan of gag orders. I mean, we're all professionals, we're attorneys. I mean, you would hope that they would say and do the right thing, or actually not say and do the wrong things, right? I mean, if evidence isn't admissible, it's not coming in, attorneys shouldn't be discussing it. I mean, just plain and simple. I mean, we play by the rules, and there's the rules of evidence. So, I mean, telling professionals what to do and what they can't do, there's free speech issues. I mean, it just, obviously, this is a case that has garnered nationwide, worldwide attention. I think it would be appropriate, if the attorneys want to provide updates to the media, because the public is following this case very, very closely.
Do you think that Noor should have been given that full 57 months, or, should he have gotten something a little less?
Great sentence here, Jeanette. I mean, his conduct was beyond reckless. I mean, to reach across your partner, shoot blindly at a silhouette or a shadow, I mean, that's just, if it's not depraved heart, I don't know what is. I understand, Minnesota law, it's one of the few states that does have that third-degree murder, depraved heart murder. I understand why the Minnesota Supreme Court said this isn't depraved heart murder, because depraved heart, your actions can't be directed at a specific individual. If so, it's either second-degree murder or manslaughter. In this case, Mohammed Noor did not have the intent, or the mens rea that we call it, for that second-degree murder. So he was just facing those manslaughter charges. But yeah, I agree. 57 months, approximately 5 years. That seems about right to me in a manslaughter case like this.
She wasn't buying it at all. Just the fact that he wanted to give back. Were you surprised by that?
Not necessarily. I mean, there's no question that he's not your typical person in state prison, but in the blink of an eye, your life can be turned upside down. And in this particular case, he took someone's life. So, um, the sentence was appropriate, in my opinion, Anjanette.
But first, I want to get your take on what he said about how this unfolded, how they gave law enforcement the heads up that they were going to the reserve and they were there with them when these items were found.
Anjanette, assuming that they weren't involved in the cover up and, setting that aside, I mean, at the end of the day, Brian Laundrie's parents are parents. If their son is indeed missing and not fled because he's a murderer, they probably want him found. So it's not surprising that they offered to help law enforcement. And it is good that Fox News was there or a third party witness, someone was recording their conduct, because we know that there's been a cloud of suspicion hanging over them because of how they handled Gabby's disappearance, between lawyering up, going camping, not immediately calling law enforcement. Again, that's not what you typically see when a loved one goes missing.
Wanted to address the victims, and it seems like maybe he did the best that he could within his abilities and capabilities. I'm not so sure, but it was very strange, the things he had to say about marijuana and drugs and things like that. What was your take on what he had to say?
Yeah, he's obviously not the most sophisticated individual, and he clearly had anxiety there. He even said he had anxiety, but still, just a very kind of bizarre statement. As an attorney, obviously I'm focused on the law. I'm glad we're moving past that initial phase of the trial. And his attorney stood and explained that even though Nikolas Cruz wants the victim's family to decide his fate, obviously that's going to be done by 12 impartial jurors. That's just not how the law works. Victims don't decide guilt or innocence or lack of guilt, nor do they decide punishment. So there was that clarifying statement that was made, and the Judge Shearer also had to let Nikolas Cruz know that the victims, although they have rights, they will not be deciding Cruz's fate.
He faced the death penalty. He got life in prison. He took the stand in that case. So in this case, do you think that he has to take the stand to help prove that insanity defense?
It's going to be tough for him to get off a second time. I was surprised, frankly, that he didn't get the death penalty. I mean, he killed his pregnant girlfriend. That was pretty egregious. But jurors love pregnant women, and they also love police officers. And when he was on the run, he killed a police officer. So it's really going to kind of be a Hail Mary on this one, whether it's the defense attorney's arguments or the defendant's own argument in this case, for him to dodge a bullet. And I use that obviously, metaphorically, a second time, because, I mean, frankly, this is someone who's gotten away with really 2 murders now and avoided death row.
Extensive news coverage about this in Florida, in Orlando at least. So that makes it really tough. I mean, you've got women crying. They don't want anything to do with this guy. Maybe they just want out of jury service, but I don't think that's the case.
Anjanette, yeah, no one wants to serve on jury duty. At least most people don't. And in this particular case, it's even worse. Folks are crying. People have already said he deserves the death penalty, prejudging the evidence. I do like what the judge is doing, though, kind of moving through these jurors quickly. Clearly, they can't be fair and impartial for the reasons that they've said. Some judges will just spend a lot of time trying to rehabilitate them, but let's just move on. Find someone who can actually sit as a juror in this case.
Some speculation that he could possibly, if it had been on the lower end of the spectrum, be out by the end of the year. Was it realistic for him to expect or even think he had a chance of anything but the maximum sentence?
I don't think so, especially when the original sentence was 12 and a half years. The judge had determined, and I know Minnesota has sentencing guidelines, and, interestingly, for both second and third degree murder, the sentence imposed in the Minnesota guidelines is 12 and a half years, that midpoint, and then obviously there's a high end and a low end of that. So the judge deemed at some point in time for 12 and a half years to be an appropriate sentence in Noor's case. Now that the third degree murder conviction was tossed on appeal, or that particular count was overturned, for Noor or his attorney to expect to walk out today by getting a low-end sentence, I just don't think that was a realistic expectation at all.
And it'll be interesting to see if this has any impact on the Chauvin case with him being convicted of third-degree murder, although it really may not matter in that case.
The facts are horrendous. I mean, jurors are not going to like him at all. It's really one of those what I call slow guilty plea. I mean, you're just marching towards the inevitable here. And now you have a client who's making your job as a defense attorney even more difficult in a difficult case because he's trying to play lawyer. He's talking to the judge. He's upsetting everyone. So it's going to be very, very hard for Lloyd's defense team here.